Wait, let's unpack this. We are heading deep into the American heartland today. When most people think of Kansas, they conjure up these simple, almost fictional images, maybe a black and white farm, maybe a tornado, certainly just vast, featureless plains. But the incredible stack of sources you provided, it shows a state defined by far more intense historical conflict, driven by massive economic machinery, and maybe most surprisingly, some real political volatility.
That stereotype, the whole flyover state thing,
Yeah.
it is the ultimate generalization. It just completely fails to capture the true complexity, the relentless drama that has unfolded on those plains.
Right.
I mean, this is a state that didn't just participate in the Civil War. It essentially served as the bloody pregame. It was the critical proving ground where the fight over slavery turned from, a political debate into outright guerrilla violence.
And it seems like that role as a laboratory has continued.
It has. Today, it continues to act as a lab for some of the most dramatic, high-stakes economic and social policy experiments in the entire country.
Exactly. And this deep dive is custom-tailored for you, our dedicated learner. We're going beyond the sunflower state and the weed state to understand its complex, almost dualistic identity. Our mission is to synthesize all this meticulously gathered material, the history, the demanding geography, the robust and, well, often contradictory economy, and the unique culture. We want to highlight the essential nuggets you absolutely need to know to be truly well-informed about Kansas.
And we're going to trace that identity meticulously. We'll start with its turbulent birth during Bleeding, Kansas. Then we'll examine that tectonic shift from being totally dependent on agriculture to becoming a modern aerospace and energy powerhouse. We'll also analyze the spectacular collapse of its radical tax experiment, and we'll finish by looking at how it's a 160-year-old rivalry with Missouri, how it's been resurrected and transformed into a billion-dollar political wrestling match over professional sports.
That is a lot of ground to cover, literally and figuratively. So let's start at the very beginning. The foundation of the state's identity, its name, and the blood that was shed to define its borders.
What's truly fascinating is that the name Kansas is fundamentally tied to the land and its original inhabitants. The state is named after the Kansas River, often known as the Kaw.
The Kaw, right.
Which itself is named after the Kaw people, also known as the Kansa, a federally recognized Native American tribe. The tribal name, natively Kakaszi, is commonly interpreted as meaning people of the South Wind.
Wow. So it immediately roots the state in its indigenous past and connects it to the environment that dominates life there.
Precisely. And tracing that history forward, the first major contact with Europeans was far earlier than many people realize. Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado arrived in 1541. That's a full century before the Mayflower landed.
100 years. That's incredible. It really serves as a stark reminder that the Great Plains region was part of the Spanish sphere of influence long, long before it was part of the United States.
Exactly. For centuries, the territory remained contested, a crossroads of empires. While most of modern Kansas was acquired by the U.S. in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase, we have to remember the southwestern corner. That part of the state was claimed territory belonging to Spain, then Mexico, and then the Republic of Texas.
Until the Mexican-American War.
Right, until that war concluded in 1848. The boundaries we see today, they aren't just lines on a map. They're the result of global conflicts, treaties, and massive land acquisitions over centuries.
And once the U.S. had possession, organized settlement followed pretty quickly, often centered around military installations.
It did, and those were designed to project power and protect trade. Fort Leavenworth, established in 1827, stands out. It was the first permanent settlement of white Americans in the future state, marking a definitive shift toward an organized U.S. presence.
And economically, the Santa Fe Trail was the first great artery of American commerce running right through the heart of the region.
The original interstate highway for trade, really. It traversed Kansas from 1821 to 1880. It was a vital supply chain, transporting manufactured goods west from Missouri and bringing back high-value silver and furs from Santa Fe. If you travel there today, you can still see the deep wagon ruts, often yards wide, etched permanently into the prairie.
Like physical scar tissue on the landscape.
That's a perfect way to put it. Documenting that historical traffic, that relentless movement of goods and ambition.
That economic and settlement pressure brings us to the most defining and frankly violent period, the one that gave Kansas its unofficial hard-earned moniker, the Free State. Let's talk about the true genesis of the Civil War, Bleeding Kansas.
This period is, it's arguably the most critical for understanding the American identity, not just Kansas's identity. The political mechanism was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It opened the territory to settlement, but also introduced the disastrous concept of popular sovereignty.
Which meant the settlers themselves got to vote on whether it would be a free state or a slave state.
Yes. The national government essentially outsourced the decision, turning a political question into basically a mandate for civil strife.
And Kansas immediately became a battlefield, an internal civil war simmering years before Fort Sumter.
Absolutely. The conflict was immediate and ferocious. You had staunch New England abolitionist free staters who founded towns like Lawrence, colliding directly with militant pro-slavery settlers streaming in, often illegally, from neighboring Missouri and Arkansas.
The Border Ruffians?
The Border Ruffians. And this wasn't just political debate. It was outright sustained guerrilla warfare. Assassinations, arson, earning the territory the nickname Bleeding Kansas.
We have specific, terrible examples that show just how ferocious it was. John Brown's Potawatomi Massacre in 1856.
A horrifying escalation. And what made it so psychologically devastating was that the line between soldier and civilian was utterly erased. These fights weren't between uniformed armies. They were between neighbors, local militias. Houses were burned, families targeted. It directly presaged the National Civil War.
And when Kansas was finally admitted as the 34th state on January 29, 1861, it entered as a free state. But the fighting didn't stop.
No, it didn't. The peak of this post-statehood violence was the incredibly destructive Quantrill's raid on Lawrence.
August 1863.
A dark, dark day. Confederate guerrilla leader William Quantrill led a raid on Lawrence, specifically targeting the heart of the Free State movement. They burned much of the city to the ground and killed nearly 200 civilian men and boys. The sheer brutality of it led to Quantrill being condemned even by some in the Confederate military. It just shows how personal the violence remained.
That foundational violence makes the next era, the post-war settlement, so remarkable. Once the Civil War was over, the state solidified its identity not just as a free state, but as a land of opportunity and a destination for freedom seekers.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The Homestead Acts of 1862 spurred agricultural development, attracting countless farmers. But the most profound social development was the arrival of the exodusters. Kansas became this powerful magnet for African Americans seeking escape from Southern discrimination and the failed promise of Reconstruction.
A massive demographic shift driven by hope and the symbolism of Kansas. Tell us more about them.
This movement was mainly in the late 1870s. Thousands of formerly enslaved people migrated to Kansas, seeing it as the symbolic land of John Brown, the abolitionist martyr. They were led by figures like Benjamin Pap Singleton, who was instrumental in organizing the migration, convincing thousands that Kansas was the new promised land.
And what challenges did they face when they got there?
Immense challenges. Poverty, lack of resources, sometimes hostility from white settlers. But they established numerous black colonies, often relying on incredible community strength. The most famous of these is Nicodemus, founded in 1877. It's a powerful testament to the state's early, if complicated, commitment to freedom.
And alongside this crucial migration came the most legendary chapter of American frontier mythology, the cattle trade.
The Wild West era. The Chisholm Trail opens up, the cattle trade booms in the 1870s, all driven by the expanding railroads. Texas Longhorns were driven hundreds of miles north to the Kansas railheads, transforming sleepy rail stops into these booming, chaotic cow towns. Dodge City instantly became synonymous with lawlessness, commerce, and violence. Queen of the cow towns.
The scale of that operation is just staggering. Our sources say in 1 year alone, 8 million head of cattle boarded trains there. 8 million.
And that volume of commerce meant you had to impose order, often violently. The money drew both successful businessmen and the most notorious criminals. And this is where you see the careers of Wild Bill Hickok and Hayes in Abilene, and both Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp serving as lawmen in Dodge City. They were the agents of that change, from frontier chaos to nascent civil order.
Moving into the 20th century, Kansas continued its trend of pioneering social movements, often leading the nation. The temperance movement is the perfect example.
It is. Kansas became the first U.S. state to adopt a constitutional amendment prohibiting all alcoholic beverages way back in 1881. This was a defining cultural force, epitomized by the notorious anti-saloon activist Carrie Nation. She started her campaign of smashing bars with a hatchet in Kiowa in 1900.
Her actions, though criminal, really solidified Kansas's reputation as a hotbed of progressive social reform, albeit one rooted in a kind of moral conservatism.
Absolutely. But before the state found its modern identity, it suffered catastrophic environmental and economic devastation in the 1930s. The Dust Bowl. It hit Kansas hard, particularly the Southwest, topsoil literally blowing away in massive black blizzards.
Hard to imagine. But even as the dust settled, an entirely new economic storm, World War II, was forging a new industrial identity in the state's cities.
That is the crucial pivot point. Our sources highlight the rapid growth in aircraft manufacturing near Wichita, dubbing it the Battle of Kansas. Companies like Boeing, Cessna, and Beechcraft ramped up production. This wartime industrial boom created the economic spine of modern Kansas, moving the state from a purely agricultural dependence into a diversified industrial and engineering power. It firmly established Wichita's lasting identity as the air capital.
That transition from dusty plains to industrial powerhouse leads us perfectly into part two, where we need to tackle the great, enduring geographical misconception about Kansas, the idea that it's completely, boringly flat.
It's the ultimate geographical myth. You hear Kansas, you picture Dorothy's Flat Farm, but it's a massive state, 15th largest by area. And it holds the distinction of having Lebanon, which is generally considered the geographic center of the contiguous United States.
But let's finally debunk the infamous pancake argument. That 2003 study said it was flatter than a pancake. It made great headlines, and the idea just stuck.
The reality is much more nuanced. When you measure it by maximum topographic relief, the difference between its highest and lowest points, Kansas has a relief of 3,360 feet. That statistic places it only as the 23rd flattest state.
So there are 22 states that are demonstrably flatter than Kansas.
Exactly, including Florida and Illinois. The land rises gradually as you move west. The highest point is Mount Sunflower, near the Colorado border, at over 4,000 feet. The lowest is the Verdigris River, down in the southeast. So you have these distinct topographical zones. The west is flat or undulating, the middle is hilly, but the eastern third has many forests and rolling hills.
Sounds like 3 states rolled into one. And that diversity is reflected in the underlying geology, I assume.
Absolutely. The eastern 2/3 are underlain by ancient sedimentary rocks, coal, and oil deposits. The western half is covered by younger sediments that wash down from the erosion of the Rocky Mountains. And the far northeast corner bears the unmistakable scars of Pleistocene glaciation.
And these large geographic boundaries are defined by massive river systems.
Water defines everything. The Missouri River defines the northeastern boundary. Then you have the critical Kansas River, the Kaw, which meets the Missouri at Kansas City. To the south, the massive Arkansas River system forms the southern drainage.
So 3 distinct geographies, which leads logically to a highly volatile climate. Kansas sits right at a climatic boundary.
It's a state of climatic extremes. It actually encompasses 3 different Köppen climate classifications.
Let's start with the most populated region, the eastern 2/3.
That area has a humid continental climate.
So
It's cool to cold winters and hot, very humid summers. The combination of high temperatures and high humidity creates extreme heat indices, especially in the urban areas.
I know the heat index there can be brutal. What kind of numbers are we talking about?
We're talking life-threatening. In the Kansas City metro, Topeka, Lawrence, the heat index frequently reaches between 107 and 114 degrees Fahrenheit, and it stays hot well into the night. It's dangerous.
And then you move west, and the experience changes dramatically.
Yes. The western third transitions into a semi-arid steppe climate. Hot, often very hot, but generally less humid summers and highly changeable winters. A surprising feature there is the Chinook wind, a warm, dry wind that can raise temperatures into the 80s even in the middle of winter.
And the third zone is the transition area near the southern border.
Correct. The south central and southeastern portions, including Wichita, dip into a humid subtropical climate, sharing characteristics with Oklahoma. Hot, humid summers, but milder winters. So you have 3 distinct meteorological realities across one state.
And because of this volatile location, we have to talk about its most famous and destructive weather trait.
Tornado Alley. It sits squarely in the heart of it. Kansas averages more than 50 tornadoes annually. It also holds a painful record. 121 degrees Fahrenheit recorded in 1936, tying for the 5th highest record high in the country. It is truly a land of meteorological extremes.
Yet, despite the intense agriculture and severe weather, it is a region of incredible natural heritage.
It is. Key sites managed by the National Park Service include the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve near Strong City, which protects the remnants of that once massive ecosystem. And historically, those protected sites tell the human story too. The Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site in Topeka is central to the civil rights struggle, and the Nicodemus National Historic Site preserves one of those key black colonies founded by the exodusters.
Moving from the natural landscape to the human landscape, let's explore how people live there. Part 3 dives into the dramatic demographic divide. Rural flight versus metropolitan sprawl.
This is perhaps the most crucial socioeconomic challenge facing Kansas today. Population density is low overall, but profoundly uneven. The focus on highly labor-efficient grain agriculture, it's resulted in a major, sustained migratory pattern out of the countryside.
The scale of that decline is shocking.
It is. One historian noted Kansas has over 6,000 ghost towns and dwindling communities. Thousands of lost towns, abandoned main streets, and contrast that rural decline with the explosive growth in the metro areas, like Johnson County and the Kansas City metro. Cities like Lenexa and Gardner grew by around 20% in just a decade. It's a tale of two Kansas economies.
Let's break down the major urban centers, starting with Northeast Kansas, the metropolitan core.
This region, the KC suburbs, Topeka, Lawrence, Manhattan, is home to over 1.5 million people. It's also the intellectual center of the state. You have the University of Kansas in Lawrence, the largest public university. You have Haskell Indian Nations University, a key center for indigenous higher education. And then there's Kansas State University in Manhattan, the nation's oldest land-grant university.
Moving south, we hit south central Kansas with its distinct identity tied to manufacturing, the air capital.
Wichita. Its identity as the air capital is entirely earned. It's a critical global manufacturing center for the aerospace industry. It hosts major facilities for Spirit Aerosystems, Bombardier, which produces Learjets, and Textron Aviation, which consolidated Cessna, Hawker, and Beechcraft.
A staggering concentration of specialized industry. And outside of aviation.
You have some fascinating quirks. Hutchinson is built on one of the world's largest salt deposits. They have a museum inside the salt mines. And it's also home to the world-renowned Kansas Cosmosphere and Space Center with one of the finest collections of space artifacts anywhere.
And our sources highlight other diverse regions, the Southeast, for instance.
The Southeast has a deep coal mining history. Pittsburgh is the largest city there, famously dubbed the fried chicken capital of Kansas. Unfortunately, it was also the site of the state's worst mine disaster at Frontenac in 1888.
Then central Kansas, with its presidential history.
That's Abilene, the former Chisholm trailhead, and, importantly, the boyhood home of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. His presidential library is there.
And finally, the Southwest, the most famous for its Wild West roots.
The iconic Dodge City territory. But this region has also expressed deep regional frustration. In 1992, there was actually a short-lived secessionist movement here, which underscores the political and cultural distance between the far-flung agricultural counties and the power centers in the Northeast.
Looking at the demographic profile overall, what defines the modern Kansan?
The state is defined by its deep Northern European ancestry, primarily white non-Hispanic, but with significant Hispanic populations and a large historical black population descended from the exodusters. Ancestry is overwhelmingly German, followed by Irish and English.
You also pointed out a profound and, well, troubling metric, the stark difference in life expectancy depending on which county you live in.
Yes, it's a profound indicator of inequality. In Johnson County, the affluent KC suburbs, life expectancy is 81.7 years. By contrast, in Wyandotte County, which faces more urban and lower income challenges, it's 75.8 years. That 6-year difference within the same state is a serious reflection of underlying disparities.
A 6-year gap is enormous. That leads us perfectly into Part 4, where we analyze the state's economic powerhouse and, more importantly, the dramatic and controversial tax experiment it recently underwent.
Economically, the state is robust, with a GDP of $226 billion. But the foundation remains agricultural. Nearly 90% of the land is devoted to farming. And when we talk agriculture, we have to talk about wheat.
How dominant is Kansas in the wheat market?
It's the undisputed heart of the grain belt. About 40% of all winter wheat grown in the U.S. is grown in Kansas, predominantly hard red winter wheat. Its high protein content makes it ideal for bread flour. That agricultural output fuels a massive food processing industry.
And outside the wheat fields, we have the aerospace industry and a surprisingly large energy sector.
Kansas is rapidly becoming a leader in renewable energy. It's a top U.S. producer of wind power. In 2019, wind generated a staggering 41% of the state's electricity. They do still rely on traditional energy. It's ranked 8th in petroleum and gas extraction, but that production is declining.
Now, let's pivot to the fiscal policy drama. that put Kansas on the national map in the 2010s. The tax overhaul labeled the country's most aggressive experiment in conservative economic policy.
This was a watershed moment driven by then-Governor Sam Brownback. The core legislation, HB 2117, was designed to create massive growth through supply-side theory. The idea was to dramatically trim income tax rates and, crucially, create expansive pass-through income tax exemptions.
Okay, so explain that pass-through income tax exemption in detail. Why was that specific mechanism the central point of the crisis?
A pass-through entity is a business like an LLC or a sole proprietorship, where profits are passed through directly to the owner's personal income tax returns. By exempting this income from state income tax, the law instantly benefited about 300,000 businesses and their owners.
So if you were a self-employed plumber or a partner in a small law firm, your tax burden just plummeted.
Exactly. The sources note that it actively encouraged tens of thousands of Kansans to claim their wages and salaries as income from a business.
Wow.
People who were essentially employees suddenly had a massive incentive to reclassify as independent contractors just to claim the exemption. This, combined with the rate cuts, led to an instantaneous gaping hole in state revenue.
And the fiscal strategy relied on a theoretical economic boom that just never happened.
It never materialized. The plan was, 1, the promise of massive trickle-down growth, and 2, to cover the immediate gap, they raised the sales tax by 1%. But the sales tax increase was entirely inadequate to cover the colossal shortfall. The budget hemorrhaged almost immediately.
What were the concrete, painful consequences for state services?
The state faced chronic budget shortfalls, culminating in a devastating $350 million shortfall by February 2017. S&P downgraded Kansas's credit rating multiple times. Critically, the cuts had threatened the viability of schools and infrastructure.
So when you say threatening schools, what does that actually look like on the ground?
Yeah. It meant school districts were forced to shorten school weeks, cut extracurriculars, institute hiring freezes. Libraries cut their hours. State highway maintenance was deferred. It created a deep sense of internal crisis.
So how did the political system finally self-correct?
The pressure became overwhelming. In 2017, a bipartisan coalition in the legislature, composed of Democrats and moderate Republicans, passed a bill to repeal the exemption and increase tax rates. Brownback vetoed it, but they successfully overrode his veto. The failure of this aggressive experiment became a national cautionary tale about fiscal prudence.
An incredible political and economic swing. It underscores the political volatility of a state often thought to be uniformly conservative. That brings us to part 5. Kansas's incredibly complex and contradictory political trajectory.
Kansas's current political identity is defined by this contradiction. On one hand, it is deeply, reliably Republican. Since 1936, only one Democrat, LBJ in '64, has carried the state in a presidential election. Classic red state territory.
But its foundational political DNA wasn't just anti-slavery. It was radically progressive in certain areas.
That progressive root can be traced back to the populist movement of the 1890s. It translated into real reforms. Kansas permitted women's suffrage in 1912, almost a decade before the 19th Amendment. It was also the first state to institute workers' compensation in 1910 and regulate the securities industry in 1911.
A powerful legacy of social protection. And globally, Kansas is cemented forever in the history of the American civil rights movement.
Irrevocably so. Kansas was the central location for the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, which banned racially segregated schools. But it's critical to understand that the decision was not universally embraced. Many residents initially opposed the ruling.
So we see this duality, deep progressive roots. Yet since the 1930s, it has solidified as one of the most socially conservative states.
That modern conservatism has manifested in clear policy choices, like the 2005 constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage.
But 2022 provided a massive shockwave that challenged that definition, the abortion referendum. How does a state that's been so conservative for generations suddenly deliver such a decisive pro-choice victory?
That August 2022 vote was a crucial moment. Kansas voters soundly rejected the Value Them Both Amendment, which would have eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion. The outcome stunned many. The key lies in that demographic divide we discussed. The large, rapidly growing metropolitan areas, the KC suburbs, Wichita, Lawrence, voted overwhelmingly to protect access, overriding the conservative rural vote.
Let's touch on some of the lasting legal quirks, particularly around alcohol, which ties back to Carrie Nation.
The ghost of prohibition lingers. Although alcohol was legalized in 1948, the sale of liquor by the drink meaning at restaurants or bars was not legal until 1986. Even as recently as 2006, Kansas still had 29 dry counties.
And bringing law right up to the minute, Kansas joined the sports betting wave.
Governor Laura Kelly signed legislation legalizing sports betting in May 2022. This move generated new state revenue, but more importantly, it positioned Kansas to be highly competitive with its neighbor, Missouri, which is central to our final section on the border war.
Before we get to that modern battleground, let's explore the state's cultural footprint in Part 6. Kansas has provided the fictional setting for some of the most iconic pieces of American literature and film.
It's a state defined by myth and popular culture. Its most famous appearance is in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, establishing Kansas as the flat, gray, mundane starting point for Dorothy. That single book gave us the idiom, "We're not in Kansas anymore."
Which makes the shift to Truman Capote's in Cold Blood so jarring. The dark, true crime side of that narrative.
That nonfiction novel chronicled the gruesome 1959 Holcomb murders. Capote deliberately chose a small, idyllic town to heighten the sense of shock. It highlighted the contrast between the perceived innocence of the plains and sudden, inexplicable horror.
Kansas is also the quintessential heartland setting for science fiction and comics.
Absolutely. The fictional town of Smallville, Kansas, is the childhood home of Superman, the ordinary setting that breeds the extraordinary hero.
And stepping away from the fictional, Kansas is home to a piece of verified Guinness World Record history in the film world.
The Plaza Cinema in Ottawa, built on May 22, 1907. It's listed by the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest operating cinema in the world.
A unique cultural landmark. Okay, let's shift gears one last time and discuss the fierce, enduring rivalry that is now shaping the state's massive policy decisions.
Yo.
The modern border war with Missouri.
This is a perfect historical loop, bringing us back to the 1850s. The bitterness from Bleeding Kansas continues to define the relationship between these two states, not least in the famous border war sports rivalry.
Kansas is defined by its deep devotion to college sports, particularly KU basketball.
KU basketball is a foundational institution. They rank first in all-time NCAA victories. KSU also has a strong tradition, particularly in football. But the rivalry extends far beyond the court. It became an economic conflict.
The economic border war in Kansas City.
For decades, both states offered massive financial incentives to poach businesses from across the state line. It was a net zero-sum game, wasting massive amounts of public resources.
But a truce was called.
In 2019, the governors signed an agreement to stop. It was hailed as a return to common sense.
However, that truce came with a crucial asterisk, and that asterisk is now defining the state's current political landscape.
The truce, according to the governor of Kansas, does not cover professional sports teams. This omission has ignited the most intense phase of the border war since the 1860s. The Kansas City Chiefs and the Kansas City Royals both currently play on the Missouri side, just a few miles from the Kansas border. Luring them across would be a massive cultural and economic coup.
And Kansas is making a massive, unprecedented financial play to do just that.
In 2024 and early 2025, the Kansas legislature passed bills offering over $1 billion in star bonds. Now, star bonds are special tax revenues collected only within a defined entertainment district. They fund the development by redirecting future sales tax revenues generated within the new stadium district.
But the risk is redirecting $1 billion of future revenue away from the general fund that supports schools and infrastructure.
Precisely. It's a huge gamble, and both teams are actively engaging with this. Both hired lobbyists in 2024 to appeal to the Kansas legislature. Talks are intensifying about bringing at least one team, maybe two, to the Kansas side.
This is the modern manifestation of Bleeding Kansas. Not ideological violence, but a high-stakes fiscal war over cultural icons.
It is the climax of a 160-year-old rivalry with bond notes instead of rifles.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? Kansas is not just a flyover state. It's a geographical crossroads that birthed the Civil War era's most ferocious conflicts. It proved radical progressive policies could flourish in the Midwest. Yet in the modern era, it served as a painful national laboratory for a dramatic and ultimately disastrous tax experiment, with the land of extremes in climate and in politics.
The key takeaway is synthesis. The historical tension between Kansas and Missouri, rooted in a fight over slavery, is still defining the state's choices today. The tension hasn't vanished. It's simply morphed, transferring from the battlefield to the halls of the legislature, where billions of dollars in public funding are the new weapons.
That makes the final question so relevant, especially considering the economic history we just analyzed. The failed Brownback tax experiment caused severe budget shortfalls that critically threatened funding for schools and infrastructure. A painful lesson. Now the state is risking over $1 billion in public financing to settle a 160-year-old rivalry and lure a sports team across a border. If Kansas succeeds in winning this modern border war, what will be the true long-term fiscal cost? And will the price of historical pride jeopardize the stability that the state fought so hard to regain? That's a question worth exploring as the state looks to define its next chapter, balancing rivalry and ambition against the necessity of fiscal prudence.